There is a place in the highlands of northeastern Africa where the air is thin and cold and ancient, where the soil is red as dried blood and the mountains rise in sheer volcanic walls above valleys that have been farmed for 10,000 years, where stone obelisks, some of the largest monolithic structures ever carved by human hands, still stand against a sky of impossible blue, silent and permanent, outlasting every empire that has risen and fallen around them, where the ruins of palaces and temples and royal tombs lie beneath the feet of people who have never stopped living here, who have farmed these highlands and prayed in these churches and buried their dead in this red earth in an unbroken continuity. Stretching back further than written, memory can reach. This is Aksum, and its story is one of the most extraordinary in the ancient world. The year is the 1st century AD, and the world is being remade in the West. The Roman Empire has just crossed the threshold from republic to autocracy, its legions holding a frontier that stretches from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Scotland, its merchants carrying olive oil and wine and glassware to markets. Across 3 continents, its currency, the universal standard of Mediterranean commerce. In the east, the Parthian Empire controls the overland silk routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, extracting enormous tolls from the caravans that carry silk and spice and jade. Westward to Roman consumers who cannot get enough of the exotic and the distant. Between these 2 giants, smaller kingdoms jockey for position, for trade access, for the diplomatic recognition that translates into commercial advantage. And in the Horn of Africa, in the high volcanic plateaus of what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, a new power is rising. A power that none of the great empires of the 1st century AD fully anticipated. A power that would, within a few generations, grow into something that the Roman writer Mahony would call one of the 4 greatest kingdoms in the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Aksum sits at a geographic intersection of extraordinary strategic value. To its north and east, through the escarpments of the Ethiopian highlands and down to the Red Sea coast, lies the port of Agelis, one of the most important trading harbors in the ancient world, a city where ships from Egypt, Arabia, India, and the far reaches of the Indian Ocean commercial network converge to exchange goods of dizzying variety. Ivory from the African interior, gold from the highlands and the rivers flowing from them, slaves captured in raids and wars across the Horn of Africa, incense, frankincense, and myrrh, the perfumed resins of trees that grew in the dry lowlands, and were valued in the ancient world as highly as gold, essential for religious ceremonies from the temples of Rome to the courts of Persia to the incense roots of Arabia, obsidian, tortoiseshell, rhinoceros horn, hippopotamus hide. Through Agelis, Aksum connected to the world. Through the world, Aksum grew rich. And through wealth came power, and through power came ambition. And through ambition came everything that followed, the conquests, the monuments, the religious transformation, the diplomatic recognition, centuries of dominance over one of the most strategically significant regions on Earth. But in the 1st century AD, none of that had happened yet. Aksum was rising, but it had not yet risen. The obelisks had not been carved. The Christian churches had not been built. The kings who would make Aksum one of the great powers of the ancient world had not yet been born. The stage was being set. The actors were taking their positions. And somewhere in the highlands of northeastern Africa, in a kingdom still finding the shape of its own destiny, the story was beginning. It would be when fully told. One of the most remarkable stories in human history. An African empire that minted its own coins, stamped first with pagan symbols, then with the cross of Christ in gold, silver, and bronze. An empire that built stone towers 100 feet tall and carved them from single pieces of granite. An empire that sent its fleet across the Red Sea to conquer the Arabian Peninsula. It's an empire that corresponded as an equal with the emperors of Rome and Byzantium. An empire that adopted Christianity before most of Europe had heard of it, and that preserved that faith through 15 centuries of isolation, invasion, and transformation into the living tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuously practiced forms of Christianity on earth, The story of Aksum is not a footnote to ancient history. It is a central chapter, one that the Western historical tradition has too long neglected, too long relegated to the margins of a narrative centered on Mediterranean civilizations. It is time to tell it in full. Every great civilization begins with geography, and the geography of Aksum is in every sense extraordinary. The Ethiopian highlands are one of the most dramatic landscapes on Earth, a vast, elevated plateau broken by deep river gorges, volcanic peaks, and the extraordinary geological feature known as the East African Rift, where the Earth's crust is slowly tearing itself apart, creating a landscape of escarpments and lakes and hot springs that gives the region an almost otherworldly quality. The highlands rise from the surrounding lowlands with dramatic suddenness in some places. The escarpment face drops thousands of feet within a few miles, from cool, well-watered plateau to scorching semi-arid lowland. Now this verticality creates extraordinary ecological diversity within a compact area. High-altitude grasslands where crops of wheat, barley, and teff grow in the cool, reliable rainfall. Lower slopes where sorghum and millet thrive. Tropical lowlands where the trees that produce frankincense and myrrh grow in the dry heat. River valleys where gold washes down from highland sources. The people who built Aksum were heirs to multiple converging civilizational streams. From the north, across the narrow southern stretch of the Red Sea, South Arabian cultural influences had been flowing into the Horn of Africa for centuries, possibly millennia, before Aksum emerged. The Sabaeans and Himyarites of what is today Yemen had established trading colonies and possibly agricultural settlements on the African side of the Red Sea, bringing with them their language, their writing system, their architectural traditions, and their gods. The Ge'ez language, the classical language of Aksum, the ancestor of modern Ethiopian Semitic languages, was shaped by this South Arabian influence, as was the early Aksumite script, which evolved from South Arabian writing into a distinctive Ethiopic script that was adapted to Ge'ez phonology and is still used today. But Aksum was not a colony of South Arabia. It was a synthesis. The South Arabian influences, mixed with the deep-rooted Cushitic agricultural and pastoral traditions of the African highlands, traditions of cattle herding, grain farming, and territorial organization that had been developing in Northeast Africa for millennia before any South Arabian contact. The result was a culture that was distinctly its own. It's neither purely African nor purely South Arabian, but a creative fusion that developed its own language, its own script, its own religious traditions, its own architectural forms. The early religious world of Aksum was polytheistic, drawing on both South Arabian and indigenous African traditions. The major gods included Maram, a war god associated with the planet Mars, who was the patron deity of the Aksumite royal family. The dynasty traced its descent from Maram, claiming divine ancestry that legitimized its authority in terms familiar across the ancient world. There was also Aster, the South Arabian equivalent of the planet Venus, and Behar, associated with the sea or the sky. These gods received sacrifices, commanded temples, and gave their names to royal inscriptions that proclaimed the king's victories, and divine favor and formulaic language that mixed triumphalism with genuine religious devotion. The royal family of Aksum, the dynasty that would eventually produce the great kings of the imperial period, claimed descent not merely from the god Merom but, according to later tradition, from the union of the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda, was identified as a queen of Ethiopia who had traveled to Jerusalem, been transformed by the wisdom of Solomon, and returned to Ethiopia carrying his child. That child, Menelik I, was said to have grown up and traveled to Jerusalem himself, visiting his father and returning to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest containing the tablets of the Ten Commandments, which Ethiopian tradition holds has been in Aksum ever since. This is not merely legend, or rather, it is legend in the sense that all royal origin myths are legend, constructed narratives that serve political and religious purposes, connecting a dynasty to sacred history in ways that legitimize its authority. But the Solomonic legend was not invented out of nothing. It reflects real historical connections, the cultural and commercial links between the Horn of Africa and the ancient Near East, the presence of Jewish communities in Ethiopia that predate the Christian era, the genuine antiquity of Aksumite civilization and its connections to the world of the Hebrew Bible. The legend was meaningful because it was built on a foundation of real relationships, real exchanges, real historical memory, however, transformed by the passage of time and the requirements of dynastic legitimacy. The kings of Aksum, who emerge into the historical record in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, are men whose names Oskals, Gadara, Aphelis, and Dubis appear in inscriptions and in the Rima.